Okay, let's bring in our panel tonight. Leslie Shedd, Republican strategist, and Dan Kennan, Democratic strategist. It's good to see you both. Thanks for joining us tonight on BBC News. Dan, I'll start with you. That phrase, cautious optimism, is one that we continue to hear. President Trump, however, seems very optimistic that a ceasefire deal is near. What do you make of the position that the Trump administration holds right now in this process?
Well, I think, Sumi, we should all be hopeful that that is true, that there's reason for optimism, cautious or otherwise. This is a tragic and terrible war. It's awful for all sides involved. It's bad for peace in the region and globally, and it must end as soon as possible. I think for the Trump administration, for the president personally, the challenge I have is that he's made a lot of promises and tried to exert leverage where he could, but I think sometimes overly optimistically, whether it's on trade deals, 90 that he'd said he'd have in 90 days that have not materialized, or ending the war in Ukraine, on day one, effectively. And of course, his proclamations on his ability to bring about peace in Gaza between the Israelis and Hamas has not come to fruition yet either. I'm also worried that we're now embroiled in this conflict potentially with Iran with a less clear understanding of whether that action has made us safer or less safe. So it's complicated, it's challenging. And while we hope for success, I think every American, Democrat or otherwise, would want the president to succeed and would want this conflict to end as peacefully and quickly as possible and forge a path forward. I'm not at all confident, given this administration has a real problem with the truth. They've not been transparent. They've not brought Congress along. They've not held the kind of even confidential classified briefings with Senate intelligence, for example, on what's happening here. And that makes me a little nervous that what they're really doing is posturing and that Trump is being played by Netanyahu and, to a lesser degree in this case, Putin.
Leslie, what do you think of that point that Dan has made, that President Trump has made foreign policy promises that he's had a hard time delivering on, and this could be another example of that?
Look, President Trump is a notorious deal maker. He has considerable leverage he can use to help, persuade Israel. And he has spent years developing relationships with some of our crucial allies in the region, including Saudi and the UAE. So if anybody can get this done, it's President Trump. Anybody that underestimates him, I think, will be sorely mistaken down the road. He has a proven track record of getting these kinds of deals done in the region. Just 2 weeks ago, he negotiated a ceasefire between Israel and Iran. So my money's on President Trump.
Leslie, to follow up on that, as our correspondent Nick Beek pointed out in his report, the big question is, of course, not the initial ceasefire. Of course, that is also up in the air, but what happens after that in Gaza, what a post-war Gaza looks like. We've heard the U.S. ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee, say that the prospect of a two-state solution is not as big of a priority as it has been for the U.S. in the past. What do you think of that?
Well, I think, whether we can take a 60-day ceasefire and turn it into something permanent is going to have a lot to do with what Israel is going to be willing to agree to. Right now, they are insisting that Hamas be completely and fully expelled from Gaza. They are refusing to discuss a two-state solution. They want their Arab neighbors in the region to take control of governing Gaza, and they are insisting that the Palestinian Authority not have any role in that government. All of those demands are reasonable. I just don't know that they're all going to be achievable. So I think that Israel is going to have to sit down with President Trump and decide, what really is the red line for them. And like I said before, President Trump is a historic deal maker. He knows how to sit down. He knows these players in this negotiation. He knows this region very, very well. And I think if anybody could get this done, it's him.
Okay, Dan, I'll put that question to you as well, just for our viewers. If you hear some of those sirens going on in the background, we are expecting Prime Minister Netanyahu's envoy to be arriving here, convoy to be arriving here any moment. And they're just coming down from Blair House, where he met with the envoy from the Trump administration, Steve Witkoff, and the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, earlier today. So that is some of the noise that you're hearing in the background. But Dan, back to that question about a two-state solution and providing a path for the Palestinians here. How do you see this?
Well, look, I don't share Leslie's appraisal of Trump's ability to get deals done in this case. However, I will say that I'm rooting for it to happen, and I do think the conditions are there to some degree for that to be the case. And because he does present a somewhat uncharacteristic posture on Middle East diplomacy, and he is his own individual in certain ways and is less dogmatic on some of the politics than perhaps past presidents of both parties have been, that creates some deal-making space. And I would love to see him exploit that. Dennis Ross, former ambassador, is someone I respect a great deal, has written a lot about statecraft in a couple of different books focusing on the Middle East in particular. I think is noted that the realities between Iran and Hamas and Israel create these conditions, but only if it can be balanced. And I worry a bit that we're so focused on the Netanyahu relationship, by we I mean Trump, that it won't be balanced in the way that it needs to be. But if they can pull back and find that deal-making space and bring folks along in a way that perhaps, there's a only Nixon can goes to China quality to this, that I would love to see be the case. So I'm rooting for it. I see some of the conditions there, but it's obviously tremendously complicated. He's overpromised. And I'm very worried by the lack of transparency and, in some cases, the lack of adults around him in the Oval Office in this second term.
Okay, I do want to ask you both about the major story here in the U.S. as well, the terrible tragedy that we witnessed in Texas with the flash flooding there. And Leslie, starting with you, as those recovery operations continue and as that community remains deeply in shock, questions are being asked about how to prevent something like this from happening again. What do you make of the conversation that we're seeing?
I mean, the scenes that you're seeing out of Texas right now are just absolutely devastating. They're heartbreaking. My niece Greer, she's 8 years old, and she's just the same age as some of these campers at Camp Mystic. And I can't help but just imagine, what if it was me? What if it was my family? And it's just horrific to see. I think that once the rescue and the recovery is over, I would really hope that the governments at all levels, federal government, state and local, sit down, really assess, look at what happened here, and then take any steps that they can to ensure that anything that was preventable here this time is prevented in the future.
Dan, I'll put that same question to you about the conversation being had about early warning systems, about weather service officials. What do you make of all of this?
Well, I share Leslie's perspective. I think that you focus on the recovery first. That is the vital task. It is, as she said, horrific, beyond words, really, what we're seeing. But I want to share two experiences from my past. I worked in the state of Wisconsin for Governor Doyle and for a state legislature, and we worked very closely on a Wisconsin disaster relief bill, not unlike the one that did not pass in Texas in this last session, as a means to get ahead of flooding and tornado damage and fire damage when the federal government could be slow to respond or perhaps wouldn't have the means to respond. Really important part of my past work. And then at EPA, as the White House liaison, I worked closely with several agencies to develop a task force following the BP Deepwater Horizon oil spill, because there were failures, at the state level, the county level, at the federal level, interagency communication issues, perhaps issues with how we would deal with some of the disbursements that would let the oil dissipate without harming marine life. All of that was complicated. And the point I make about both those experiences in this moment, I don't think you should blame anybody for what happened. And I think Democrats should be careful not to try to politicize this. I don't think they are, but they should be careful. But you should take care to be introspective, and government needs to be introspective and analyze and
right.
Look at the data to make sure we understand what did happen and what is preventable. And I do believe this is an opportunity for the administration to do what it has not done, which is to not politicize science. There are 40% of the weather forecasting stations in this country are 20% or worse deficits in their capacity for staffing. Okay. That's a problem. I'm not saying that's what caused this incident. I don't think that was the case. In fact, there's some reporting to indicate that the forecasting was actually pretty good and then the warning signs weren't heeded properly. But
right.
Nonetheless, it's a moment to look at that and understand we can do better than we should.
Okay, Dan and Leslie, great to get your analysis tonight. Thank you both so much for joining us on BBC News.